Sometimes school completely throws us under a bus. They tell us to memorize random facts, which, by the way, most of the time have absolutely no relevance to our lives, so that we can't actually understand it well. And not only that, they don't teach us how to learn and memorize it quickly. So, the worst part of all, actually, is that they define our success based on this. If you're not able to memorize random facts, you're considered unsuccessful. Well, don't worry, because first of all, you're not unsuccessful if you can't memorize random facts. And secondly, I'll teach you exactly how I memorize stupid stuff for school in this video. By the way, if you don't know me already, I have a 95 average last semester. I didn't get my results yet this semester yet. And last year, I got a 95 average in religion. And specifically, without wasting my life away. I didn't geek out all day. I actually gymmed like 4 to 5 times a week, sometimes like every single day on the week. I socialized every single day of the week. I started a YouTube channel. I did all random like stuff, developing tons of different skills in my life, all while getting a 95 average. And by the way, the reason why I mentioned 95 in religion is because religion is one of those subjects similar to philosophy, history, languages, which all really heavily rely on fact memorization. To get a 95 in these subjects, you really need to master the skill of memorizing. So let's get right into the advice. The first thing that you must do is do a technique which I found, and I actually found myself and then realized there's a term for it called problem-based learning. Learn through problems. If you need to memorize facts, don't just hop into the lecture slides or like the textbook and start reading. Actually know exactly what you need to memorize by looking at past tests, practice questions, and all these questions which point exactly to a knowledge gap that you need to fill. Whenever you're trying to memorize anything, always link it to a question and see whether or not that question will be reasonably asked on a test. For example, if your test is likely going to have random multiple choice questions like, oh, what does this word mean? Then it would actually be reasonable to memorize the definition of those terms. Whereas if you know for a fact that in chemistry, you're not going to have random multiple choice questions like that, then what's the point of memorizing the facts? Rather, you want to understand the other higher order, meaning like more in-depth questions. By the way, if you don't have practice questions or past tests, you can just go into each lesson's homework questions. Or if you even don't have that, then go into the learning goals of each lesson and then put that into ChatGPT or something and then ask it to generate questions. Now, of course, with ChatGPT, it doesn't have enough context to give you the perfect questions, but those questions are better than nothing. If you don't trust ChatGPT in that moment, which most of the time I actually don't, I would just look at the learning goals and see exactly what is it that the specific knowledge that it's actually trying to get me to learn. And that's the type of question, I guess, that would work for me. Now, once you found the questions that you need to memorize the answers to, the biggest possible thing that I would tell you to do, the biggest step towards memorizing is actually to understand it as much as possible. Of course, you've probably heard me say this before. I used to think that most of the time you can just understand the memorization, meaning like you can just understand it to the point where you don't really need to purposely go back and spacing effect and like stupid stuff like that. I'll explain it later in the video if you don't understand. But what I realized was, sometimes school is like just like there's the stupidest things you need to memorize. Some things you just can't associate a deeper understanding to enough so that your brain will actually find it relevant. But for most of the time, you can at least associate it with 1, 2, 3 other pieces of information, and you must do that at this step. This is the best way to memorize things, to understand it deeply enough. Now, of course, this entire video is on rote memorization, the things that you can't actually remember through deep understanding. So keep this in mind. You only rote memorize when you can't assign enough relevance to the piece of information and the relevance isn't strong enough for you to just understand and know it. Only then is the best move to rote memorize, which I'll talk about in the next step. So the next step is chunking. Imagine you have a box of Legos, and that is your brain, and every single Lego is a piece of information. Now, imagine you want to take out a bunch of information because you're being tested, right? So you reach into the Lego box and you grab one Lego and you place it out. And you grab another one and you reach back in, grab another one, place it out, grab another one. And all of a sudden, you'll realize it takes a long time to grab each Lego brick one by one and take it out. Whereas in the second scenario, you need to take out every single brick, but you look into the box and you realize, oh, wait, there's a ton of bricks stuck together. Someone built something in there. So you just reach in, you grab that big piece of Legos stuck together, take it out. All of a sudden, your task time is reduced by half. This is essentially the power of chunking. If you have a ton of information in your brain and you chunk it together, meaning you associate the pieces of information together, you can reach in your brain and grab a big chunk of information instead of having to take out one information piece one by one. And by the way, it's also easier to find that piece of information, which actually fits in with the Lego analogy really well. Imagine, those small, like one by one, like circular pieces. It's impossible to find those in a big Lego box. Whereas if you associate like 100 of them in one, obviously you can find that. It's the same thing with information. So technically, understanding as deep as possible is chunking because you're associating understanding with the piece of information. But like I explained before, if there's not deep enough relevance in the specific scenarios where you can't understand it deeply enough, then you're going to rely on other methods of chunking. And the other methods I'm going to talk about are called mnemonics. You probably heard of that. It's just the same thing, literally associating different pieces of information together to memorize it better. Here are a few different mnemonic techniques that I've used and I think are the most useful ones. First of all, acronyms. In my philosophy test a few weeks ago, I had to memorize 7 different philosophers and all of them and what they did. And essentially what happened was, by the way, I'll just read out the 7 different philosophers, right? It's Thales, Anaximander, Parmenides, Heraclitus, Empedocles, Leucippus, and Democritus. So I had to actually understand exactly like one or two basically the biggest points about what they thought. And what I realized was if I associate the first letter of each name, I get the word tap-held, which I don't even know what that word means. I'm not sure if it even is a word, but it looks like something that is relevant. It looks like something I can remember. With acronyms, as long as you can somewhat fit together the first letters of different words together, you can associate the pieces of knowledge. You've probably heard of like the rainbow, Roy G. Biv. Roy G. Biv doesn't make sense at all, but at least you have some sort of chunk together. And this specific word, tap held, made me understand the 7 philosophers that I had to memorize way easier. Now I know not only the exact order, but also a hint to what their name sounds like. The second type of mnemonic is visualizing. Sometimes when you're trying to memorize something, you can actually kind of like screenshot a visual image of the note. I don't know if you understand what I mean, but imagine looking at, let's say, physics, right? You look at your notes and you wrote F equals ma. Instead of remembering F equals ma, you look at the picture and you remember the picture of F equals ma. I don't know if that makes sense to you or not, but essentially, you know how when you look at a photo and then you look away and then you have kind of like a residual image. It's the same thing with this technique. When you look at F equals ma and you look away, you can have like a residual image in your brain, and that associates the formula with a visual image instead of just like 4 characters, right? Another way to use the mnemonic of visualizations is just to know the meaning of the thing and then visualize that. So this is really good for terms in different languages, for example. If you look at a term, not only associate with your mother language definition, but you can also associate with a picture in your brain. So whenever you look at a dog in a different language, you can actually visualize, oh wait, this means dog, and then you think of the picture of a dog. Honestly, the general idea of mnemonics is just to attach any meaning, and any meaning can mean the most stupidest things. For example, I used to use this in chemistry class, and I still remember it to this day just because of how stupid it is and funny. And I guess when it spikes emotions, it also makes you memorize more. So the more funny or stupid it is, it can actually make it better. What I used to think was I was trying to memorize homogeneous and heterogeneous as terms for like mixtures and things, right? And you can probably know where this goes, right? Homosexual is pretty much being gay, right? And that makes sense because gay people like the same race. So that means homogeneous solutions are like the same. So I would think, whenever I read homogeneous, I would just think gay in my brain and it would all make sense. And if it was heterogeneous, I would just think not gay, which means that it's a mixture of like different stuff. You don't need a specific tactic to memorize everything. You can actually associate it with any stupid way that you like to think of the thing, and that if it helps you memorize it, then it will work. And you don't need to change it just because there's no technique called that or something. Now, of course, the problem with mnemonics is that sometimes it doesn't associate with the meaning. For example, in the beginning, I talked about acronyms and I told you about TAP held, the acronym for the 7 philosophers I had to memorize. But just because I have the first letter of the names, I can memorize the names better, but it doesn't help me memorize the meaning behind the name and like what the guy actually did. But it's not all that bad because attaching the deep understanding with a mnemonic, combining different like chunking techniques or like mnemonics, it all associates more knowledge with each other, creating a stronger and deeper understanding and more relevance in your brain, which means your brain will remember it longer. Now, associating a deeper understanding and chunking with mnemonics is the most important step to memorizing things. If you can't think of a single way to actually associate more knowledge to that thing you have to memorize, then too bad. Let's move on to the next step, which is the actual memorization part. Step 4, active recall. You might have heard every other study here talk about this, and yes, active recall is technically the best study technique. Let's just say that. What is active recall? Active recall, you can just think of it as taking information out of your brain. Now, there's 3 different methods. The first way is to consume it, to put it in your brain. The second way is to recognize it. So you look at something and then you also use your brain to recognize it. The third one is when you take information out of your brain. These 3 methods are called encoding, recognizing, or recognition, and retrieval. And active recall is just retrieval, meaning you're just taking information out of your brain. And this is scientifically proven the best method to memorize something. An interesting point that I'd like to bring up is the fact that school teaches in such a passive way that people actually believe that putting information in your brain is the better way to learn, when in reality, taking information out, actually using your brain and thinking like a human being is the better way to learn. So how do we use active recall? Now that you have that specific knowledge that you want to memorize associated with as much knowledge as possible to make it as relevant as possible, you want to be able to look away from your notes, have no cues at all, meaning like you don't have anything cueing your memory, so you're not recognizing anything, just staring at a blank wall, closing your eyes, or not, like you don't want any help, right? And using your brain only, be able to output what you tried to memorize. So let's say I'm trying to memorize the 7 philosophers again, right? And now I clearly remember the acronym TAP held, but can I actually recognize the 7 names? So I'm gonna not look at my notes. So like I'm covering my computer screen down here, right? And then I'm gonna say it in my own brain. And then, well, I don't remember like Thales, Anaximander, and then like the rest of them, right? If I can successfully do that, then that is 1 rep of active recall. Now, step 5, desirable difficulties. Desirable difficulties is a learning science term, same as active recall, and I'll explain it really quickly. What desirable difficulties means is that learning science has found that the more strain you put on your brain to recognize or encode or even retrieve something, the more it consolidates in your brain, meaning the harder you try to use a piece of information, or the more effort you put into using a piece of information, the more you remember it. And this is why it's called desirable difficulties, is because these are the type of difficulties that you want in order to improve your learning. Now, obviously, if you're multitasking or doing something completely unrelated to learning, and that's making your learning more difficult, like you're shifting your focus somewhere else, obviously that won't help your learning. Desirable difficulties doesn't mean any difficulty towards learning helps your learning. I said learning twice. Meaning, like, multitasking doesn't help you learn. Distracting yourself more doesn't help you learn. Just focusing more on the specific thing and using your brain to, like, straining your brain more on that specific learning task does help you more. Now, there's a few different techniques to increase the desirable difficulties. One of which you probably heard of just as much as active recall. I spoiled it. Space repetition, or spacing effect. The more longer you wait, the more you forget, and the harder it is to retrieve that information. And the harder it is, desirable difficulties, indicating that, putting more strain on our brain, my brain will think that it's more important. It will try to remember it more in the long term. It's honestly, the desirable difficulties, by the way, it's a good analogy to relate it to gym. The more you strain your arm or like your muscle, like any muscle in your body, the more it grows, because your brain thinks, my muscle is getting strained. That muscle needs to be stronger, so I need to grow it. So now we combine active recall with spaced repetition. And finally, we get a very good technique for memorization. So combining active recall with spaced repetition, it gets us pretty much us trying to say the thing, waiting a little bit until we forget a little bit, and then trying to say it again. Now, this is also another reason why associating problems to what you're trying to memorize is always a good thing. Because let's say the first time you try to memorize, you just use active recall the first time, right? So I'm trying to memorize the same philosophy example, tap help. Okay, I say it all at once without any help. Okay, good. Now I'm going to use the spacing effect to wait a little bit. Maybe the first time it might just be 10 seconds, right? Because your memory's not going to be that good. And now after you wait, you can look back at the question and see if you can specifically answer that question. If you can't, you can look at the answer and then try to do active recall again and actually try to output the information from your brain. But if you can, then what you can do is you can learn something else in the meantime, and then eventually go back to the same question and then try to output the same answer. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Wow, this sounds a lot like flashcards. Of course, if you're trying to memorize specific answers to specific questions, it's going to sound like flashcards. By the way, I don't really like flashcards because there's not much novelty and it's just boring. Like, bro, who wants to sit in like their house for like an hour a day answering the same questions over and over again, right? So what I usually do is, once I'm kind of competent, so let's say I can wait a while and like I can understand it deeply enough, if active recalled enough and desirable difficulties, whatever, I can confidently say, okay, yeah, when this test question comes up, I can answer it. I'm just going to move on to different questions. That does not mean like I'm never going to read that question ever again. It's just like maybe I'm just going to wait like 1 or 2 hours later, like at the very end of my session of studying, I might just go through all the questions that I've like look and understand the answer to. And that's the only time when I'll go back to that. I'm not going to constantly actively come back to the same thing like flashcards tell you to do. Instead of trying to stick with the flashcard style of understanding and then memorizing and doing the same questions over and over again, try to incorporate as much novelty in your studying as much as possible. Because first of all, the more fun it is, the better you can memorize it, because dopamine is a driver of neuroplasticity, means dopamine actually helps you learn. And secondly, novelty will increase your deeper understanding. So first of all, when you're trying to memorize something, you want to chunk it as much as possible, understand it as deeply as possible. Then you want to use active recall, meaning you want to say it in your own head. Can you say it without any help? So this specifically reduces as much illusions of learning as possible. And be very mindful of your confidence. If you can say it, but you're not confident at all, then that proves that you don't actually understand it. And that proves that you have a ton of illusions of learning. By the way, illusions of learning are kind of like moments when your brain is not really clear about what it actually knows. Now, once you can confidently do active recall, then you want to incorporate some desirable difficulties like spaced repetition. And specifically, while you're waiting, you're not just going to AFK, right? You're going to do other questions. So this is why I like coming back to the same question after a while. And this is kind of like interleaving, which is like studying different subjects. But I actually don't like that at all, because when you're in math mode, you don't want to be switching to English mode. Like, it's just a complete disruption of your flow state. Stick to the same test you're studying for in the same subject, but switch up the questions over and over again once you get hang of specific questions. Now, step 6, answer more difficult questions. You don't want to be staying at the same low-level memorization, fact memorization questions, because first of all, your test probably isn't only multiple choice or something like that. Maybe it is, and I might be wrong, but most of the time there's going to be some short answer question, right? And those are the questions that you're going to mess up on if you only memorize. Because like I told you before, memorizing specific facts, it doesn't associate that much meaning to it. And this is why I also said in the beginning, you want to associate as much meaning as possible to the facts that you're memorizing. Always, my principle for studying is do what you're practicing for and optimize it for learning. If your test has fact memorization questions and short answer, then you want to be studying by doing practice questions, testing you on fact memorization and short answer. And by the way, you should probably know this already, but short answer, you have to write more, and it's a harder, more difficult question testing you on more deeper levels of knowledge, meaning it's trying to see if you have a deeper understanding. And if you only stick to the memorization level, you won't be able to answer the deep understanding questions. Plus, the reason why I mentioned this, obviously you're going to be doing different types of questions. The reason why I mentioned this is because when you do deeper understanding questions, that actually helps you with fact memorization as well. Because think about it. Let's say you're in history class and there's like a matching section to events and dates. You can practice that. You can practice active recalling, spaced repetition, those specific facts you'll know will come out in the test when studying. And what you can do is, for the potential short answer questions in that test, you can practice explaining all of the different events in your own words to prove that you deeply understand it. And what you'll find is that when you actually understand those specific events very deeply, you'll find it's way more easier to associate the date with that event, because there's just more information and more knowledge to create a deeper, more relevant piece of information in your head. Now, the final thing I want to say, step 7, if you want to get 100% on the test, usually with these fact memorization heavy subjects, you want to be listening in class as much as possible, because there's so much micro things that the teacher will say that won't be in the notes, that won't be in the lecture slides, but that surprisingly you have to memorize or like know, right? And you have to be picking up on these things. But of course, don't blame yourself if you get like 95 like I do. Like, I don't care, bro. I just don't care about getting 100% on these stupid the stupidest questions. Like, they don't define your success at all. Just keep that in mind when you're like raging over 99 if you're a nerd like I used to be. Just keep it in mind, bro. Like, it does not matter. There's like, whenever I see a question that I just genuinely did not know the answer to, meaning there was nothing I could have done in my control to get that mark, I just think to myself, okay, well, there's nothing I could have done, and this does not define my success at all. Like, if it was like an actually important question that tested a useful skill in my life, then sure, but it wasn't. So 99% of the time it isn't. so I just don't bother. And yes, if you want to get 100%, you can reread the lecture slides and notes, but what I would say is do my technique first of like looking at practice questions and memorizing the answers, problem-based learning, do that first. And then you can look at this lecture slides as last minute review. That will be helpful, but the shallow understanding and a ton of, like, if you constantly reread stuff, you have tons of illusions of learning. Your brain doesn't actually know what you know. So that sucks. I would do it as a last resort, last minute technique. You can join my Discord server, link in the description, for more advice. I sometimes do weekly calls in there. And if you like my advice, you can click this video to watch more.